but I think the last session that we had was really valuable for all of us to see all the different types of activities that are going on. And one of the things that David Hayes said this morning was talking about things that are relevant. And sage-grouse, at this day, this time, this year, last year, and into the future, is relevant. And it's something at the forefront of many of us, our minds and the things that we're working on. And Raul just gave a presentation on sage-grouse, and this session has been set up to continue that conversation, to answer your questions, to have a dialogue, and to talk about sage-grouse and where we are and where we're going. Susan is going to facilitate for us today. She was here earlier this morning, and Raul Morales has agreed to stick around and continue with the question and answer session of this topic today. So let's begin. Do you want to make any follow-up remarks about sage-grouse today?
Well, I mean, just that I was obviously rushed at the very end there. So.
Why don't you come over here, Mark?
I just know, okay. I just knew as I was sitting down there I was going to run out of time and I was going to miss some key points. But I do want to make sure that we do follow up with any questions you have. But I do want to talk a little bit about that consistency issue. It's a challenge culturally for an agency like the BLM to make that transition. And I remember talking to the NRCS folks when they brought out their Sage-grouse initiative they refer to as SGI. And the challenges they were having with folks at the field level, recognizing that the things they were doing on the ground were different than the way they'd done in the past, and that they had to consider sage-grouse, and that was a big emphasis, and they were going through that same cultural change from their folks who were used to doing things a certain way. BLM is happening the same way with BLM. Our managers at that field level have always been encouraged to develop partnerships, to work with your community, and a lot of them have done that. They've invested a lot of time in those partnerships, they've built relationships over time, and lo and behold, this sage-grouse issue comes up that's putting, I think, a strain, a challenge to some of those partnerships because it is very sweeping for us. And our managers are recognizing that they're going to lose that individuality that we have promoted for so many years with the BLM. And so those are some of the changes that we're starting to see right now in the agency, and those are some of the things that we're addressing. As a matter of fact, there's a big meeting in Reno right now where we're looking at those 68 land use plans. Some of our offices want to roll out some of these RMPs prior to September 2014. The question we're asking ourselves is, okay, how are you going to take that National Technical Team report and those conservation measures? How are you going to get public comment on that? You know, if you roll out earlier, what are the impacts to the rest of the offices that plan to have their EISs or land use plans amended by September 2014? So internally, those are some of the things that we're trying to figure out, and we're trying to get that answer this week in Reno as we speak. So I'm just going to open it up to anyone with questions right now that wanted to follow up what I just talked about here.
With respect to the overall, my name is Terry Riley, representing the North American Grouse Partnership. With respect to the overall effort that you are going to, the planning effort, and the idea that you're going to get some scoping done, that perhaps more than just what you did with the public comments that you're receiving now or already have received. How does an organization like the North American Grouse Partnership, which kind of functions as a conduit to the scientists and to all the efforts that are going on for sage-grouse and other species, how do we as an organization become something more than just a public?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, we've tried over the years to become more than that, but we're always kind of rendered that just another member of the public.
Right.
And as a result, the efforts that the group can make towards reviewing what you produce and maybe even giving it a stamp of approval or something like that as far as whether it has the capacity to actually do something.
Right.
And this has been a major issue with lesser prairie chickens on beyond land in Mexico and other areas. But it's been a very significant problem. And I know it's hard for agencies to reach out to groups, but it's important to do that, or else, people pick scientists to pieces if they have to stand up individually. If you have an organization that represents them, or at least provides a conduit to them and can render advice based on what those scientists have to say, and might review what you have done. I think the partnership between the North American Grouse Partnership on this effort would be a lot better than just rendering us.
Sure. So you bring up a very good point, because we've actually heard that from our other stakeholders too, as far as how can they have more involvement than the quick scoping period that we have, which even though we did extend it, like I said, this train is moving very fast. We cannot delay the time frame. That's not an option for us. So the way that I think that's now, so the next step is, okay, where's stakeholder involvement? Okay, when the draft comes out a year from now, obviously the stakeholders can review that and provide comments. But I also think between now and that draft, requesting meetings, public meetings, briefings about where we're at with the process, having us explain what we're at, what we're looking at, you guys providing some comments to us. I think we'll take those public comment, as we develop alternatives, we'll use the scoping comments that we got that we closed on the 23rd to come up with alternatives. But I also think that information will be very valuable when we go out with the draft and we start the next round of comment and period to, based on what we've heard through the other stakeholders in the interim, start formulating maybe what changes to the drafts that will come out. So what I would suggest is request, public meetings, whether you attend WAFA. Do you go to the WAFA, Western Association? We're always talking Sage-grouse there at the Executive Oversight Committee. Where are you based out of? Washington? Okay. I would request the Colorado, is Lee, SB, Lee, are you here? She's my counterpart here in Colorado. I would ask her, hey, come and talk to me about Sage-grouse. Come and talk to our organization about Sage-grouse, where you're at and what's going on. Just ideas and thoughts. So free flow of information.
You're still rendering us just as another member of the public. And that's the problem we're facing, is that we send in comments, they then get jumbled up with the 23 million other comments we get and summarized by some contractor, and then they give it back to you to try to develop alternatives, courses of action under an environmental impact statement. And then you're just again ending up as another member of the public, and you're not really reaching out to scientists as a group and dealing with the issue. You're kind of marginalizing the effort through a large
Well, so our planning process is what it is. I'm really trying to figure out how you can feel that you're more than just one of 23 million.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Nope. Did you have another question? Okay.
No, actually, I have a response,
Okay.
if I may. I'm Rick Carney with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I serve on the Great Basin LCC steering committee. And I think there may be an opportunity for members of organizations like your own to be part of an LCC effort to pull together some of the technical information that's going to be required in developing these plans. And so while Fort Collins falls outside of a particular LCC, I'd be very interested in speaking with you about your knowledge and involvement in the Great Basin. I think this being an LCC workshop would be a great opportunity for folks who are here and associated with LCCs to get together and see how they might participate.
Sounds like a great conversation you guys might get to have after.
Y'all.
Sort of follow up, I'm Rick Soto with the Great Northern LCC. The Great Northern is also sponsoring a Sage Step Partner Forum. It's just starting to get off the ground. I'm sure that Terry, you'd be more than welcome if you haven't already invited specifically to that one. And that's another great place to incorporate that. It's not specifically related to the ESA listing in the BLM, but it's a broader perspective on how the LCCs can benefit Sage-grouse management.
Well, the North American Grouse Partnership has developed very specific recommendations for what needs to be done with Sage-grouse based on the science, based on the best judgment of the grouse biologists out there. But transmitting that to the agency has a tendency to all that get lost. It really does. It's like, I don't know how else to explain it. It's just not a very good situation if you have the experts there saying, here's what has to be done. Very specific. And it's lost in the process.
We might want to Not to cut you off, but I know there's some other people who are interested too, but you make a good point, and I think we...
And we can talk a little more about it too. Sorry. Yes.
Thomas Conley from USGS in Sacramento. Raul, I appreciate that you put this up there because that graph, the histogram graph, yeah. If I remember correctly, I think that was data from maybe 2005 or 2006.
Correct. 2005.
And on the priority threats. And I was wondering, now that we're in 2011 or 2012, and climate change is rearing itself more prevalently now, and also we're moving towards alternative energy sources. Have those priorities shifted now?
Well, from Fish and Wildlife perspective, you see climate change is down here at the bottom. Fish and Wildlife Services said climate change in relation to wildland fire and invasive species, strong tie-in, very strong tie-in. So in a sense, that kind of elevates climate change as it relates to those two particular projects. So I don't say it hasn't been forgotten. I think it's highlighted back with the invasive species and wildland fire.
But have the other priorities changed since 2005 and you guys have...
Like I said, the one that changed in 2005 is renewable energy.
So, but you're using Fish and Wildlife? Okay.
Question?
Yeah, I'm Andrea Ray from NOAA, and I just wanted to second that comment about climate changes. It's a big interacting factor, or potentially a big interacting factor for invasive species and wildlife. So
Yep.
it's kind of thing that, and climate variability, so why is this year different than last year, or
Right.
years of drought is another one that's a big interacting factor.
Yep. I agree. Thank you for the support. I was one of the things we're having a hard time getting the public to understand is that if there's one threat that BLM can't issue an IM or an edict on, and that is wildland fire starts. We just can't say no more wildland fire starts, please come to us before you start them. We can control everything else on that list there, but that wildland fire starts is a challenging one for us. So what we have to do is pre-position our fire resources in areas that are going to be priority areas for sage-grouse. We're looking at trying to address funding issues to get more funding to treat habitats that are important to sage-grouse. You know, we're looking at some site-specific tools, whether it's livestock grazing, intense livestock grazing to control cheatgrass. If we have a good cheatgrass here, fire breaks, you know, so we're looking at a whole, bag of tools to try to protect the priority sage-grouse. And it's going to be challenging because we may have to do things on the landscape that make us uncomfortable. But a few acres of treatment to protect a 100-acre block, you got to look at it and say, you got to weigh the trade-offs. You know, really, what are we doing? Because if we lose that 100-acre block because we were fighting over the few acres that we were trying to treat to protect, we're losing the battle.
Raul, I want to move to the comment you made in your speech about the consistency issue on the landscape across BLM districts and states, et cetera. You know, every state's going on. Brian Rutledge of the Audubon Society. And we're moving across each state, trying to have inputs, trying to see that this is met consistently, and yet we're seeing great differentiation across various districts within BLM. We're seeing everything from the scientifically semi-supportable 1 pad per 640 to master leasing plans that call for 1 pad per 160 that we know won't sustain droughts. And how we get that consistency across all those measures in a big, unwieldy organization that's now moving faster than it's ever moved before, I think it demands a great deal of discussion and very serious review. So I just would be interested in your comments.
Well, I agree with you. And the meeting back in Reno right now is back there specifically to address those consistency issues. And Fish and Wildlife Service is involved in our meeting. And I really continue to emphasize the Fish and Wildlife Service. If there is something we are doing that you're uncomfortable with, you need to raise your hand. And that's what I'm hoping they're doing. And I talked to Pat, and I said, Pat, we just don't want to go down a road that where you guys later on said that's not working for us and it's kind of too late. I think they understand that. So I'm encouraged we're having a discussion because we recognize there are some consistency differences. And I think some can be okay, but it's probably the extreme end and not the common way of approaching things. And so I'll be interested to see what comes out of that meeting as far as how to address that.
If I may, I just put out one statistic for others to consider when they think about this issue, and that's that we're having still to protest is detail where the RFPs are not yet developed. So it's really, this is a serious issue that's closing the door on flexibility for BLM at the same time that BLM is setting the table for dinner, so.
Appreciate the comment.
Yes.
Yes. My name is Janet Edgar. I'm with the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins. And so, Roel, I was just curious about the presentations this morning, and the plenaries were about sort of being forward-thinking, looking at conservation, not just at a species level, but imagining advancing to ecological processes, as well as looking at conservation, you know, that in a climate-altered future. And so I also understand all the constraints of the planning process that's sort of on the move. But are there some things that you are working at in sort of a new and different collaborative way to help embrace some of those discussions that were talked about this morning? Because it seems like because of the pace and because of the, you know, the process, that we're sort of back to one species, you know, lots of teams, draft EISs, final EISs, and really not able to embrace a new approach to really important species and a whole ecosystem.
So that's a good question. That's a very good question. And I guess you could debate whether things like the sage-grouse and northern spotted owl, when you look at the planning efforts, are species plans or ecosystem landscape plans. And I would venture a lot of things that we're doing for sage-grouse benefit a lot of the other sagebrush obligate species. And I think it's the same thing with the northern spotted owl. But, I mean, obviously, those are debatable, because what's good for someone may not be good for the other. One of the discussions we're going to have on Wednesday, or Thursday, excuse me, is an agency discussion about, with the 4 LCCs, about some of the things you brought up. What do we need to be doing for sage-grouse and its habitats in the LCCs with the bird that addresses either whether some of these threats, whether it's focused on climate change, whether it's focused on getting information out. So I think we're looking at it from that standpoint as a strong direction from the department level for the LCCs to come up with a plan by which to, how best LCCs can play in this sage-grouse effort. Because I recognize this planning effort is on a fast track. We don't have any options to stop it. It's one of those things that's going to get pulled into the train as we move forward. And so I think it's timely that we do have that discussion and see what makes sense to bring it into that system. Linda has a question.
Todd Hopkins here, he's our science coordinator for the Great Basin LCC, and he was saying to me, talk about the bi-state.
Bi-state decision support tool.
Either one of you?
Cool.
The bi-state distinct subpopulation has got a separate panel going. It's a listing decision here for greater sage-grouse. There is a USGS scientist and a group working on a decision support tool for basically strategically restoring and fixing the population system by working at specific habitats. In other words, whether you're looking at brood areas, whether you're looking at community renewal, where you get the biggest change in the actual life history of the bird and where you get more birds. That's not something that's easy to do. It's not fully funded, but it's a model that's in draft right now, and they're trying to get some money for aerial photography. It's based on radio telemetry, some modeling. It isn't an end-all product in that it isn't fully proven, but it is a possible pilot. It's a decision support tool that targets specific life history attributes of the bi-state. So that is in the works, and that is probably going to be too late for the listing decision for either one of these by the time there's enough information. But it is something new and different that the LM is working collaboratively on. The Forest Service, Cal Fish and Game, Nevada Department of Wildlife, who I'm missing.
Well, like you said, USGS.
USGS, yeah. So there is a
NRCS,
different,
yeah.
NRCS, different collaborative process, and different collaborative model being worked on.
I just want to check as we go to these other questions. Can everybody hear okay the questions and the answers? If you can't, be sure and wave your hand so that we know when the last people to speak up. Sir?
My name is Billy Gascoigne with Fort Collins Science Center, USGS. And you mentioned that this listing decision is pretty much right around the corner, about a year and a half coming up. And I was wondering, how knowledgeable is BLM about potential impacts to say, livestock grazing and oil gas development on their lands. Have you guys started running these impact assessments either at a larger national scale, or are field officers doing these assessments of estimating the impact of various activities on BLM lands?
So the impact of what we're doing for sage-grouse on those uses?
If a listing was reached,
Right.
how would that impact current activities on BLM lands?
Well, that's going to be part of it when we develop the alternatives and we look at the social economic, and that'll be part of that description right there. And I believe we have that contracted, correct me if I'm wrong, Kate, social, is contractor, right? Yeah, so it's, we're going to look at the impact of a potential listing or the management of how we do sage-grouse on a variety of resources and uses out there on public lands.
Well, all right. I think with your sage-grouse management strategy and socioeconomic impacts, you're looking at different RMPs, you're promoting different sage-grouse management strategies, and then you're doing socioeconomic impacts for those various strategies. But if a listing was reached, I could be wrong, but I've been talking to folks out of Washington on sage-grouse strategy for BLM, and nobody's really mentioned if you guys are having discussions on whether or not you know what a scenario might be to current activity levels.
And I think you're bringing up a good point. I don't think we're at that level yet.
Yeah, you mentioned learning from the
Spotted owl.
Spotted owl.
Right.
I didn't know if you guys are starting to address those big questions already or not.
It is one of the issues that I brought up since I wasn't going to be at the Reno meeting, and I told my boss, I said, we really need to make sure we talk to the Oregon folks about how our process, what can we learn from their process with this process, and hopefully that discussion is going to happen, because I think there's a lot we can be learned there. Just like the spotted owl issue is still going on, folks need to recognize across our landscape, sage-grouse is not going away. It's the way we're going to do business on public lands. And to make light of kind of the job that I'm doing right now, because you have to find some humor in this effort, I have a saying that says, warning, entering sage-grouse country, enter at your own risk, because there is a lot of unknowns when you're coming into it at this point, and people need to understand that, you're going to be in sage-grouse country, you're going to be making sure that we apply the right measures and we manage the habitat for the birds forever,
Sir? Sean Finn, Science Coordinator for the Great Northern LCC. Thanks for your presentation. My question, I have two parts to the question. The first is there a strategic kind of approach to the way that the rapid eco-regional assessment information is going to be incorporated into the resource management plans? There's a scaling issue involved there, and also the RAs, if I'm correct on this, is an all-lands approach where we're talking about incorporating and understanding the effects of sagebrush habitats outside of BLM land ownership. How do the RMPs deal with, how do they interface with the all-lands approach?
So that's a good point. I wanted to kind of bring that up earlier, but we were running out of time. But the RIA's rapid ecological assessments that the Bureau has been doing for the past year plus on several of these landscapes across the West are coming to completion. We really should be having the data soon. I understand our Denver office probably has a lot of the data right now. The intent of those RIAs was data gathering, pulling existing information that was out there so that we could then take a look at it across the landscape and see where we have holes, where are we good, where do we need to go, so that when we take that information and we call it the step-down process, whether it's in our RMPs or some other efforts, what do we need to get to address whatever the important issues are for that particular region that the RIA did its information on. The goal of the RIAs really was to kind of develop conservation areas across our landscape, so areas that were important for conservation that we should protect for conservation values, and in those areas and across our landscape that maybe should be considered for development purposes, where the conservation values are maybe lower, and we could try to focus development into those areas. So I think with the RIAs coming out, it will be part of our planning process as we start developing the alternatives. So I think it's timely for a lot of the areas that we have sage-grouse in. We will take that information, plus the information we've gathered with the sage-grouse, and meld it together as we develop the alternatives.
Do the RFPs discuss the neighboring landowners and coordination as far as habitat management across the boundary?
So you say maybe like private or other?
Who's on the other side of the line?
Yeah, we will talk about it. Like I said, Forest Service is part of it. So, I think the Forest Service can use some of that information too as they look at their plans for the 20 forest plans that will be amended through this process. Of course, NRCS has been very engaged in what they're doing across the landscape. We do want to marry up our actions because our private users, use or benefit from NRCS and BLM, in the management of their private lands and their operations. So yeah, that is the goal. Yep.
And for those that are standing in the back, naturally, we have room up front. So if you want to come up, please feel free. It's informal, no problem at all. Sir, and then...
There's a $10 bill right here. I see it.
Really, it's okay. Feel free to, we don't have time to
That's good.
I'm Jeff Morrison with the North Central Climate Science Center. And I apologize if you address this, I was understanding that I would come in for your talk, but can you imagine in a year and a half saying something along the lines, or maybe you could finish the sentence, well, if it wasn't for the LCCs and the climate science centers, they haven't really been, I don't even know if they exist in the context of this meeting so far. I think Dave Diego mentioned that, but that's been about it. Given that, we had, if it wasn't for the LCCs and the climate science centers, we wouldn't have done what?
X.
I mean, do you have any idea?
An airplane flight over, I was looking at the National Technical Team report, and I reread what the scientists have put together regarding the science and kind of what the needs still are, and kind of categorize it in two areas. There are some short-term needs that I think science can answer some questions, and then there are projects that are longer term, i.e. climate change. That if we do something, try to figure out what we're going to do for climate change, it's really going to be years down the road before we see any true benefits from that. So it's kind of like, so where's the best bang for our buck for LCCs at this point, given the dollars we're talking about? Where do we need to go? And we need to get climate change is big. We need to start figuring some stuff out on climate change. Is that going to help us in the immediate needs? I don't know, but we got to start. The scientists also said one of the things that's the science is weak on sage-grouse is on some science where there's very few replications of a particular model, that it strengthens some of the existing science that we used in there. So there's benefits, because obviously people are going to try to pick apart the science. That's a given. So is that the best bang to go and strengthen some of our areas? For instance, we got a lot of science on oil and gas development, very little on renewable energy. So we're taking oil and gas science and applying it to renewable energy, because there's a lot of similarities, but there's also differences. What is the impact of wind farms on sage-grouse? So we look at transmission lines and prairie chickens, and so we take that science and apply it over here. So I think you had a very good question. I might have to sleep on that tonight to really come up with a good answer, but that's a good one. And I think that's something for us to consider on Thursday morning.
Todd Hopkins, Great Basin Science Coordinator. I sit in the office with BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS is downstairs. I've had the BLM coordinator for all the EIS and sit down in the office and go, please tell me what to do for adaptation planning and actions, please. They really need that help, and that's where the LCCs and the climate science centers can do that. It's not going to be a pre-listing kind of thing, but it's a long-term strategy, and I think that's the strategy we can help with.
Okay. Sir, in the lecture?
Yeah, Dave Melton from the Nature Conservancy. Thanks for your talk. We've obviously been sure, like everyone else, tracking this very closely. My kind of question to you was on the preliminary priority and general habitat maps, which obviously would seem to be pretty important, given, as you said, the Miami model for political conservation. My question is, are those going to be, is there going to be sort of like a separate review process, a public review process for those, or will they come out in FCIS, or how will that happen?
So that's a very good question. Nevada released theirs maybe 2 weeks ago, because we wanted to get public comments. The public was definitely telling us where are those PPH, we call them PPH and PGH maps, because we want to provide public comments. I know other states aren't quite there. I know other states are getting ready to release them after the closing period. So we're kind of all over the board on what's been released and not released, because we're working with the state agencies in developing those maps, and the governors of the states have gotten very involved in those maps, and rightfully so. They're looking at it, so some governors aren't ready to release it, particularly states like Idaho Utah that are looking at trying to come up with their own governor's executive order like they did in Wyoming. So I think they want to make sure the maps that they roll out with that executive order is what they want it to look like. So the answer to your question is, outside of Nevada, during this planning process, we're probably not going to get a lot of comments for the other states because they haven't released it. The first time they're actually going to be able to provide comments is during that draft, when the draft document comes out and we kind of reveal across the West what's PPH and PGH. Kate, I don't know if you want to add anything from Montana's perspective?
Sure. I'm Kate Mitchell, the Associate State Director for BLM in Montana. And just, I guess, to reiterate what Raul has said, we're all in sort of different stages in different states, and Montana has had those priority habitats identified for at least 3 or 4 years. And both priority protection habitats as well as restoration, priority restoration areas. So, and those have been pretty actively vetted publicly and with the various stakeholders. So those are a fundamental part of the land use planning in Montana. And we're all in sort of different stages as well, because in Montana, we're doing full plan revisions. They aren't just plan amendments driven by sage-grouse conservation. So it's really actually less of a species-specific driven planning effort, but our plans do incorporate sage-grouse conservation as a major priority issue. But it is a more integrated planning effort. To talk about the role of LCCs, to respond to your question, Jeff, and to Sean's, I think in Montana, one of the challenges that we face is the mixed ownership. BLM really isn't a continuous surface land manager. And so I think a critical role that the landscape conservation cooperatives can play is to facilitate that collaboration among all of the surface owners and actually the land ownership to have a more cohesive conservation strategy across the landscape. BLM, when we're looking at our impact analysis, we'll be really looking at how our actions are contributing to the conservation of the species or not. And in Montana, there are lots of situations where even if we did everything we could to protect those priority habitats, it may not really make a difference for the bird. So this is where that collaborative conservation is going to be really critical. And I think to also get to your point about analyzing the scenario if the bird was listed, I don't think that we really have contemplated that idea, as far as I know. But it's a very good point to somehow factor that in. One of the things that we're trying to facilitate consistency on ultimately, and the real proof in the pudding is going to be the cumulative analysis of all of these plans across the landscape and what that means to the bird. And it might be most logical in the context of that cumulative analysis to include the what if the bird was listed scenario. So it's kind of complicated, and I think ultimately another thing that the LCC and science can bring is some consistent analytical approaches in the cumulative impact analysis as well as just our individual plan analyses. That's another place where I think we could strengthen our consistency. It's not just about consistency of management, it's really the outcome on the landscape that's going to be most important. I know you have a question, Brian. I just want to check, see if there's anyone who hasn't asked a question yet that's got a burning one otherwise. So. Go ahead, Brian.
First, I'd respond to a couple of things that have been asked. One of them is that when Freedom Call estimated the impact in Wyoming of what the listing would mean, I think he came up with $80 billion as the Wyoming impact. And so I think you can't do a direct derivative of that, but that's pretty substantial to begin with. Second one was we impacted 70 species of conservation concern in Wyoming with the core habitat establishment, not just sage-grouse, to the point back here. But what I would ask Raul is, we're looking at in Wyoming, the Wyoming plan, which everybody's sort of leaning on. We have the strongest population left anywhere of sage-grouse. And I'm very concerned that as we move out into the states with less population and more challenge in a lot of instances, that we're working on scaling the approach that we do For example, we went with 5% disturbance in Wyoming. 5% disturbance in some of these habitats would mean the end of the bird on the range, and probably a lot of other species go with it. Is that in consideration as far as you can tell as we're approaching this plan?
Yes, it definitely is. And matter of fact, the National Technical Team report, based on the Wyoming model of using 5%, Dr. Noggle, who has a paper that he hasn't quite published, is saying it's probably better at the 3% level, and that's what's in the National Technical Team report. Of course, people are screaming about the 3%. Where the heck did that come from? You know, so it is professional judgment based on research that he has done that he hasn't gotten it up to. That's going to be, as you know, a big area of debate. I suspect we'll get a lot of public comments on that. You know, a state like Wyoming, where you have a lot of birds in a good habitat, and Utah's got very dispersed populations across the states. You know, what is that going to look like? I don't know, but you know, that's to me, when the Fish and Wildlife Service refers to that number, it's a key component as to, I think, the success of how we come out at the end there. And I suspect you know, it's going to be in that range, I bet you. And when he says a 5% disturbance, it's kind of within the core area in Wyoming, whatever that is, and we're looking at the priority areas. And one of the things I look at our map is kind of like, particularly Nevada's map, I said, so what is the blob of priority habitat that we're going to look at to apply that 3% rule? Those are things we still have to kind of discuss, and we haven't gotten there yet.
Good questions, comments, ma'am?
Dolly, and wondering about the habitat, is there discussions happening across state lines to make sure that the priority habitats in one state complements adjacent states? And then second question is on the R&D revisions that are occurring, the 68 plus 24 service, is there a timeline out there for stakeholders to have a sense of when these are going to come out?
Yep.
So they're supposed to prepare on common time?
Yes. So the answer to your first question is definitely yes. Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Service, Fish and Wildlife Agencies, that has been one of their big issues that they've talked about is the edge mapping. And of course, each state is developing their maps differently, looking at different criteria. So it's kind of like, oh boy, this is fun. They even said, oh boy, this is going to be fun. But the message has been received. We have to make sure that if one state has priority habitats up to the state line, and you go across the state line and it doesn't look any different, why? You know, and I think that as we start to see those maps, that'll be one of the other focus areas in the planning effort, is that whole edge mapping, and to make sure that it does make sense. If there's a good reason why, we need to be able to explain why.
I'm gonna make that big. Is that all right?
Sure.
Sorry.
I was going to delete it somehow, so I didn't. Okay.
There we go.
So that's your first question. Second question, this is the timeline that we're at right now. Like I said, the public scoping, which is now completed, closed March 23rd. We're starting to develop the no action alternative, and we'll start developing some of the other alternatives. So the next time people are actually going to see something is, like I said, about a year from now, when the draft is published, where the Bureau will have the preferred alternative. So that'll be, I'd say, basically a year from now at that point, where people can kind of see that.
Well, I think there are nuances, or, you know, it depends on where you are.
Right, Kate was mentioning her point.
You know, I'm not sure, but there should be sort of a master list posted to our BLM website on where all these different plans, the status of those plans, and when the public comment period would occur. Because Montana will be rolling out drafts in less than the next 6 months. So, you know, it would be wise to go to that national website and see what the status of different plans are. And we can take that back and make sure that that information is available, so that.
Currently, it's not on either of these.
It's not? Okay.
At least not obviously, again, but it's not on either of the websites.
Okay. Well, that's good feedback.
And I think that an issue that Kate is bringing up is kind of the focus of the meeting in Reno this week. We know there are some offices that have plans that they would really like to roll out. And collectively, we're talking about what would that mean if you roll out some plans before the rest of the plans coming out there. So we're seriously having a leadership moment in Reno right now to discuss the strategy, discuss if we roll some out, how are we going to explain that so the public isn't confused. So that's kind of the big part of the week, because we kind of saw that. We saw where people could be confused with how we're rolling out some of our plans. So
Maybe they could be tweeting during their meeting.
everybody knows.
Feedback I got is already, it was intense meetings yesterday, so.
Other questions or comments? And I captured that so we can see if we can get some information on that, then we can make that available to others. You just have a lot of important things. And again, just want to check, because I'm always wanting to check just to be sure that everybody's getting an opportunity. Anyone else at the moment? Okay.
Amanda Stanley with the Wilberforce Foundation, and I'm wondering about connectivity between populations. You mentioned in Montana that you wouldn't be able to do conservation alone on land, and I think it's not an uncommon situation. And then when we're trying to look at connecting populations, I think that probably gets even more important to be looking outside of BLM lands and outside of federal lands. And so as, you've got the broad EIS, but then each RMP, how are you going to fit that together and be thinking about these broader issues of connectivity?
So, just so you know, we did think about it,
Yeah, I'm sure you.
but we came up with no answer. When the National Technical Team got together and we looked at those conservation measures, our focus, because of time, was on the priority habitats. What do we want to see for conservation measures in the priority habitats? And we recognize there are still two outliers, which is what we're calling the priority general habitat. We did make some suggestions on conservation measures for the priority general habitat, but we didn't spend a lot of time on that because of time constraints we had to get this report out. And the other big thing was the connectivity issue. And some of us were thinking, do we have to have a third designation? So primary general, primary priority, and then connectivity. And so one of the things we're just starting to discuss is how are we going to do that? We're going to pull this national technical team together to try to finish that up, or we're going to try to address it during the planning phase that we're under right now. And so, that discussion is occurring right now. So, thank you.
And any of you, if you ever have thoughts on how some of these might be addressed, I'm sure you'd love to be hearing those. So if you can throw your ideas, that'd be great. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
Talking about all the different potential partnerships that folks are involved, recently heard about the formation of the Western Governors Task Force.
Mm-hmm.
Can you provide any clarity on how BLM is working with them and how they're part of this whole process?
That's a good question. Just a second. So Ken Mayer, the director for Nevada Department of Wildlife, has got a very similar question because there's so many people involved. There's so many different efforts going on that he put together, and I don't even have the final copy because they sent me BlackBerry, but he tried to take a stab, and this is what it is. I know you can't see it, I'll go over in a second, but he tried to take a stab of who is doing what with sage-grouse across the West. Because we wanted to make sure we were not doing overlapping data. We wanted to make sure we were complementary to all the efforts that are going on. So this governor's, what they're calling, the term right now is State Federal Sage-grouse Task Force. And I'm going to make sure that we're referring to Governor Meade, Governor Hickenlooper, kind of the lead effort with Bob Abbey, yes. That group, is being developed. So I think I haven't been involved too much in those meetings, or I just know they're starting to get going. But their goal is to make sure they're not coming up with something different than what we're doing BLM, what the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Service agencies, WASLA is doing. So they're trying to be complementary. They're standing up what they call this COT team, the Conservation Objective Team. The goal of that team is to kind of come up with the bar from Fish and Wildlife's perspective and working with the state agencies on what success will look like so that we know during our planning phase if we're going to hit that bar. And I can't imagine how that's going to go. Because we've all been asking for that for years and it's been very challenging. State Fish and Game agencies are kind of, based on data they have, I think they've been a little timid to stretch out too far in the box. Fish and Wildlife Service was asking for it, BLM was asking for it. But that was, I think, one of the outcomes of that state task force was Fish and Wildlife Service develop a bar that we can shoot for. So, and they're going to be meeting here starting in April, and supposedly we're supposed to have a product by the end of May.
Frank, did you start?
Actually, Dolly made me think of something that I would bring up, and that is that in some cases, the BLM's publishing on their website is becoming much more difficult to pump in figuring out what's actually going on with sage-grouse, particularly as it deals with ongoing leasing. And I would ask if you're aware of any efforts to straighten that out, where it's a little more possible to know what they're actually projecting to do in upcoming sales, or
The quarter,
is there a plot for obfuscation?
no, not plots. Each state has quarterly sales, as it comes to oil and gas. But what you're saying is you're not seeing it timely.
The leases that are projected as potential for sale are easy to discern.
Okay,
The BLM is setting aside many of those leases to their credit for the sake of sage-grouse. Finally getting to what it is you're actually protesting can take weeks of work to plumb that out of what's available on the website.
okay. Because it's not being updated. It's
You
not.
actually end up protesting many more leases
Then you need to.
than you need to.
Gotcha. That's a
And
good point.
the process for obtaining this information varies dramatically from state to state.
Okay.
So it makes the stakeholder involvement process very challenging.
Okay. And that's, yeah, I mean, that's good feedback for us. Another one
But
that.
you don't know the clause.
Some people think BLM already has the preferred alternative picked out. I think if I hear that one more time, I'm going to ask them for it.
You meant oil and gas, oil and gas, is that right?
It's all kinds of
Or any kind of-
things.
Yeah, I know. Okay. Anything else? Okay, well, let me just wrap up, if there's nothing else, I just want to wrap up real quick. This effort that we are going through is definitely a game changer for the Bureau of Land Management. The way we manage our public lands is significantly going to change. I say we are rewriting history right now. The outcome of it, the success or the failure of it, will be part of the history books. I'm very optimistic that we will be positive, because not only is this effort that we are undertaking going to affect how we use our public lands, I also think from the Endangered Species Act itself is going to have a big impact, because you think about the partnerships, the resources, all the effort that is going into trying to keep a species off of the list, and if we are unsuccessful, people are going to say, what else can we possibly do to make the Endangered Species Act? And I think Fish and Wildlife Service has heard that message loud and clearly. So I think when we're talking about skin in the game, they've got a lot of skin in this game too. And I think that's why I'm very optimistic, because we still have options. We still have time with the sage-grouse to keep it off of the list. It's not where we're dealing with 10 of them left. We still have a lot of them left, and we still have a fair amount of habitat left. So, but I am very excited about this process and this effort, and it's really a fun time to be involved with it myself, so. Okay.
Linda, did you have some closing remarks?
I want to thank Raul for taking time out of his busy sage-grouse schedule to come and visit with us today on sage-grouse. It's a timely topic. I know that all of us have an interest in it. And sitting in the office, our Great Basin LCC, me, the coordinator, and Todd, the science coordinator, are in the BLM office, and sage-grouse is all around us. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come to Denver and addressing us today. Raul. Thanks.
So please do check your program, guys, because there's some interesting and exciting things this evening. There's poster session, tools, great networking opportunities, so hopefully you'll take advantage of that. And we'll see you tomorrow.